The fire raged on like it had a reason to burn, crackling and spitting out embers that danced on the wind. The man stood by the fence, his back stiff, hands at his sides, watching as the barn he'd built, the barn he'd sweated over, fell apart in flames. He didn't speak, didn't move. The crackle and roar of the fire swallowed up the silence between him and the land. He didn't know why he was still standing there. Maybe it was the years that had worn him thin, or maybe it was the fact that there was no reason to run anymore. The barn was gone, and it was like the rest of his life, burning down to ash. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the chaos of fire, a soft crunch of dry earth beneath bare feet. He turned slowly. A girl stood in the smoke, the flames catching in her hair, her dress tattered, streaked with soot. Her face, untouched by the fire's heat, was calm, like she'd walked through a door and not a storm of flames. She didn't seem out of place. She took a step closer, and another, barefoot. Like it didn't matter, she raised her hand slowly, like she was offering him something delicate. Her fingers curled, revealing a small locket, shining even in the smoke. It caught the light from the fire. He didn't speak, didn't move. The weight of the locket pulled his gaze down. She didn't say anything at first, just held it there, in front of him. Then her voice came soft and steady. "Can I call you Papa?" The question hung in the air like a bird too afraid to fly. He blinked, his heart slamming against his ribs. The smoke burned his eyes, but it wasn't just the smoke. Her words were a bullet, a sharp, clean shot straight into the chest. He stared at the locket, the gold still warm from the fire. His breath caught a sudden tightness in his throat. The name on the locket, his name. His real name, not the one he'd left behind. The girl's eyes never wavered. She didn't ask again, didn't flinch at his silence. She only waited. "Why are you—" He started, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat, tried again. "What's your name?" The girl didn't answer right away. Instead, she just stared at him, her face unreadable. "Clara," she finally said, so softly it almost got lost in the wind. Clara. The name didn't fit the scene, didn't fit the fire. Didn't fit the girl standing in front of him with a locket he didn't know he'd lost. He wanted to say something else, anything, but his throat was tight, like the words had gotten stuck somewhere between the past and whatever was about to happen next. The fire crackled again. He could feel the heat even from where he stood, but it didn't matter anymore. The barn was gone, the fire was winning, and he was stuck between something old and something new. Something that didn't belong to him but was already there, knocking at his door. "What happened?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. She looked past him, toward the smoldering remains of the barn. "It's done." Her voice was matter-of-fact, like she'd been waiting for it to happen all along. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the dry ground. He reached out slowly, his hand trembling as he took the locket from her. She didn't pull away. The metal was warm, too warm for something that had been sitting in the air for only a few moments. "I don't know you," he said, the words thick on his tongue. The girl smiled, just a little, like she knew something he didn't. "You will." She turned, like she was already walking away from him, but didn't leave. She paused just a few steps from him, and then said, "You know me." Her words lingered, wrapped around the air like smoke. He looked at her again, something twisting in his chest. He stepped forward. "Wait." But she was already moving toward the road, her bare feet silent on the earth. He wanted to call her back, to ask what she meant, but he didn't. He couldn't. His mind was still spinning with the memory of the fire, of her words, of the locket, of something he couldn't grasp. Instead, he just stood there, the locket cold in his hand, the flames dying behind him, and the girl walking away, like she had been there all along. He stared at the locket in his hand, the warmth still lingering from the fire. His fingers hovered over it for a moment before he turned it over, looking for the clasp. It was there, hidden beneath the ornate design. His thumb pressed down, and the locket opened with a quiet snap. Inside was a photograph, worn with age. His breath caught when he saw it. It was him, younger, with a stiff collar and a military uniform that still smelled like the damp of war camps. His face was leaner, sharper. There was no mistaking the eyes, his eyes. But it was the woman beside him that made him falter. Her smile was soft, but there was something about her that he couldn't place. He'd never seen her before, not in this life anyway. She wore a dress that belonged to a time he couldn't quite remember, and she was holding a baby in her arms, wrapped in a blanket he'd never seen. He looked back at the girl, his mind spinning. Who is she? His voice was strained, but he couldn't stop the words from coming out. He felt like something was slipping through his fingers. The girl, Clara, stood with her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on him like she was waiting for him to remember. "That's my mother," she said, the words falling out like they were a truth too old to be doubted. He shook his head. "Your mother? But you don't remember her?" Clara's voice was sharp now, not accusing, but expectant. "You should. She was your wife." He felt his heart skip, a heavy knot forming in his stomach. His fingers clenched around the locket as though the metal could hold the truth together. He looked at her, the girl who stood there. With his name in her mouth and a woman in her eyes he didn't remember. "I never married anyone," he muttered, the words tasting bitter. "I couldn't have." Clara stepped closer, and he felt the weight of her gaze. Her eyes were too knowing, too calm. "You did. She was taken from you, from both of you." The fire crackled behind them, but the sound seemed distant now, muffled by the growing pressure in his chest. He turned his eyes back to the photo, trying to make sense of it. His younger self looked so different, so full of something he couldn't touch. The woman beside him had a face that carried love, pain, something too familiar and yet too distant for him to claim. "How?" His voice came out hoarse. "How do you know this? How do you know me?" Clara's gaze softened, but there was no pity in it. Just a quiet kind of knowing. She didn't speak right away, just watched him as he stared at the photo again, trying to piece it together, trying to remember something that felt like a lifetime ago. The locket clicked shut on its own. He hadn't moved his thumb. It just closed. The snap was final, like the last page of a book being turned over. He stared at it for a moment, his heart beating a little faster now, more out of confusion than fear. The locket was warm again, but this time he didn't feel the same pull. It wasn't just the heat from the fire anymore. It felt like something was being held back, something he couldn't reach. He opened it again, his hands trembling, but the photo was gone. It had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the empty space inside. His chest tightened, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. "What the hell is going on?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned the locket over, checked both sides, as if it might reveal something he'd missed, but it was empty. No picture, no nothing. Clara stood silent. The firelight flickered in her eyes, casting long shadows across her face. She didn't look surprised. In fact, she looked like she'd been waiting for this. "Don't worry," she said softly, as though her words were meant to settle something inside him. "You'll see her again, when the time comes." The locket was still warm, but its magic, or whatever this was, seemed to have faded. He let it fall back into his palm, unsure of what to do with it. He had no memory of a life with her, no memory of her face or her name. But the weight of the locket felt like the weight of a lost future, of something that had slipped through his fingers before he could even grasp it. Clara turned, the movement graceful but purposeful. "It's time to go," she said. And before he could ask her anything else, she started walking away, her bare feet making no sound on the ground. He didn't know why, but he followed her. Maybe it was the pull of the locket in his hand, or the quiet ache in his chest that demanded answers. But he followed her without thinking, the fire behind them slowly dying to nothing but embers. As they walked, the world seemed to narrow. The barn, the fire, the earth under his boots. It all seemed so far away, like it had never been real to begin with. The only thing left was Clara, and the empty locket in his hand. He didn't argue. Clara unrolled her blanket on the porch as if she'd done it 1,000 times before. The evening was cool, the sun just dipping behind the hills. The house stood quiet, the last remnants of smoke from the barn curling into the sky. She didn't speak as she spread it out, just moved with a purpose, like she'd done this too before. Her fingers worked quickly, the fabric snapping against the wind as she smoothed it out. He watched her, his boots planted firmly on the worn wood of the porch. She was a stranger to him, yet she wasn't. "I hear better from here," she finally said, her voice soft but steady. She didn't look at him when she spoke. She just sat down, the blanket now laid flat beneath her. Her bare feet dangled off the edge of the porch, toes brushing the dust. The house behind him creaked, the familiar sound of the floorboards shifting, but it felt different now. He couldn't place it. There was something in the air, something in the silence. "You can't stay out here," he said, though the words felt foreign. He had a house, a bed, a roof that could keep the cold off. He should offer her shelter. She didn't answer, but her eyes met his for a moment, a brief, almost unreadable look. She didn't look like a girl who needed anything. She looked like someone who had everything figured out. He stood there watching her for longer than he intended. Finally, he turned and stepped inside. His boots echoed on the hardwood floors, a reminder of everything that had been left behind. The silence in the house swallowed him whole. Night came slowly, the air thick with the weight of something unspoken. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for sounds he couldn't place. The house felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. The floorboards creaked again, but this time it wasn't from inside. He walked to the door, pulled it open, and there she was. Clara, lying on her back, her eyes wide open, staring at the sky like it held all the answers. Her breath was steady, but there was a strange tension in the way she lay, like she was listening for something just beyond the reach of the night. Her blanket was spread across the porch, the same one she'd laid earlier. Her feet were bare again, and the moonlight cast long shadows across her face. She didn't move when he stepped outside, didn't even blink. "What are you doing?" His voice was low, trying not to disturb the quiet. "I told you," she replied, her eyes never leaving the stars. "I hear better from here." The wind picked up, tugging at the corners of the blanket. He could smell the earth, the dust, the remnants of the fire. "Don't you want to be inside?" He stepped closer, his boots scraping against the rough porch wood. "It's not safe out here." She shifted slightly, her hands folded over her stomach. "I'm fine." He stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do with the space between them. He could feel the cold air now, settling in his bones. The night was moving in, and it felt colder than it should. Then she began to hum. It was a soft, slow tune, like a lullaby, but unfamiliar. He'd never heard it before. The melody wove through the night, the notes gentle and haunting, like they belonged to a place he couldn't reach. Her voice was low, soft enough that he almost couldn't hear it, but it was there, echoing in the stillness. He listened, rooted to the spot. The sound was strange, unsettling. He couldn't place it, couldn't make sense of how she knew it. It wasn't a song anyone here would sing, and yet there it was. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She didn't answer right away. She just kept humming, the tune filling the spaces between them, leaving him with an ache he couldn't explain. The longer she hummed, the more he felt the pull of it, like the song was reaching inside of him, touching something buried deep in his chest, a memory he couldn't grasp. Finally, her voice trailed off, and the silence returned. She turned her head to look at him, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something. Not sadness, not anger, but something that felt like understanding. "I don't know," she said quietly, her gaze steady. "It just comes." He stood there, looking at her, at the blanket, at the sky stretching out above them. He couldn't tell if she was part of this world or something else. When he finally turned to go back inside, she didn't move. And that night, as the wind began to howl outside, he lay awake again, listening for something he couldn't hear, waiting for the next sound that might finally explain it all. The whispers started the moment Clara set foot on the land. At first, it was just a flicker, the kind of glance you catch from the corner of your eye, the kind of quiet that fills the spaces between breaths. But then it grew. First the neighbors, then the storekeepers, then the men who'd been drinking their coffee at the diner. A girl, no older than 16, showing up at the old ranch in the middle of the night. Barefoot, with no family, no story. It wasn't right. No one trusted it, and no one trusted him either. The man who let her stay. The man who'd built the ranch, whose wife had been buried in the earth behind it. The one who never talked about her, and the one who never asked questions. He wasn't prepared for the knock. It came like a fist to the chest, quick and sharp. He was sitting at the kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey half empty beside him. The floor creaked as he stood, his hand steady on the counter. His breath felt thick, like he'd been holding it too long. He opened the door, and there stood Sheriff Finch, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. He didn't say a word at first, just stared, holding out a folded piece of paper, the kind of paper that hadn't seen daylight in years. The sheriff's face was unreadable, his lips pressed tight. He didn't need to speak. Not yet. The rancher took the paper slowly, feeling the weight of it. It was sealed, the wax dark and cold. When he saw it, his heart jumped in his chest. The seal was his wife's. She died 5 years ago. She hadn't been in that grave for 5 years. She couldn't have sent a letter, but there it was. The paper had a scent to it, musty and old, like something forgotten, buried long ago. The sheriff stood in the doorway, not moving, not saying anything. "What is this?" The rancher's voice sounded foreign to him, rough, like he hadn't spoken in days. "I'm just the messenger," the sheriff replied, his eyes flicking toward Clara, who was sitting on the porch, staring into the distance like she wasn't part of it, like she didn't know what was happening. The rancher broke the seal, his hands trembling. The letter was short, only a few lines written in his wife's handwriting, the same cursive that used to fill the house with its soft curve. "He will return. He will remember what he has forgotten. Protect the child. If you let her go, everything will be lost." The words hit him like a blow. He'd forgotten. Hadn't even realized he'd forgotten until now. And the child, the girl. Clara, she was the key. He looked up at the sheriff, who hadn't moved. His expression hadn't changed, but the weight in his eyes told a different story. The rancher could feel it. The way the sheriff had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him to read the letter, to remember. The sheriff stepped forward slowly until he was inside. He didn't need to be invited. The tension in the room thickened. "What does it mean?" the rancher asked, but the words felt hollow, like he already knew the answer. "I don't know," the sheriff said quietly, eyes flicking back to Clara. "But you know as well as I do that this ain't a coincidence. You think she showed up here just to sit on your porch? You think she doesn't know things?" The rancher swallowed, his mouth dry. "You're saying... Is it real? This curse?" The sheriff's gaze hardened. "It ain't a curse if you're not willing to face it." Clara didn't move from the porch. She hadn't even blinked, but the rancher felt the weight of her presence now, the way she'd been tied to this place, to everything. He turned the letter over in his hands, his fingers pressing against the worn edges. There was no mistaking it now. His wife had known. She had known what was coming, and now the pieces were falling into place. "I need to know what you're hiding," the sheriff said, his voice low but firm. "All this time you've kept it buried. You're going to dig it up now, or it's going to bury you." The rancher shook his head. "I don't know what you mean." His voice cracked, but it was too late to pretend. "You do," the sheriff replied. "We all do." The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, like a rope tied around their necks. The rancher could hear his heart pounding, could feel the tightness in his chest. "I need you to leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The sheriff didn't argue. He just turned and walked back toward the door, leaving the rancher standing in the room with the letter, with the weight of the past settling around him like dust. Outside, Clara still sat on the porch. Her back was straight, her gaze distant. She didn't look at him when he stepped outside. She didn't need to. "You know," he whispered, barely breathing the words. "You've always known." Clara turned her head, meeting his eyes. "I've always known," she replied, and the weight of her words hit him like a freight train, pushing him back into the past, where it all began. The evening was still, too still, the kind of quiet that settled into your bones and refused to leave. He stood at the threshold of the house, the door slightly ajar, watching as Clara walked past him without a word. She didn't look back and didn't need to. Her eyes were fixed on something ahead, on the path that led to the old stable, to the well behind it. It had been dry for as long as he could remember. The ranch was built on the promise of water, but the well had stopped giving up its secrets long ago. It was nothing but a hole in the ground now, a reminder of something lost. And yet, as Clara walked toward it, there was a certainty in her steps. She reached the well, her feet soft on the earth, and knelt down before it. The silence stretched between them, heavy, like the air before a storm. He didn't move, but his eyes followed her every movement. He didn't trust them well. Not anymore. She didn't even hesitate. She lowered her head, the tips of her fingers brushing the stone rim, and whispered something low, so soft he almost couldn't hear it. Her words were foreign, a language he didn't recognize. It wasn't a prayer, but it might have been. A greeting, maybe, or a warning. "I'm back," she said, her voice light, but it carried through the stillness like a promise. The rancher's heart skipped, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He stepped forward, unable to keep the unease from creeping into his chest. He didn't know why, but the sound of her voice near the well felt wrong, like it was stirring something in the earth, something buried. He opened his mouth to call her back, but before he could, the well answered. A sharp, hollow knock echoed up from the dark depths. 3 knocks, quick and deliberate, like a knock on wood. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Her hand pressed harder against the stone. Her eyes closed now, as though listening, as though waiting for the well to speak again. The rancher's pulse quickened. He stepped closer, his boots scraping against the dry ground. "Clara," he called, his voice thick with uncertainty. But she didn't respond. She didn't even move. Another knock came from the well. Knock, knock, knock. He froze. His breath caught in his throat. The sound wasn't just the wind. It wasn't the creak of an old house or the rustle of leaves. It was coming from deep within the earth, coming from somewhere that shouldn't be. "What is that?" he whispered to himself, his feet now planted to the ground as though the soil beneath him had taken root. Clara slowly opened her eyes, but they weren't filled with fear. They weren't filled with anything at all. They were empty, not in the way of a person who had given up, but in the way of someone who had seen the truth and accepted it. She spoke again, but this time her voice was steady, calm, like she was speaking to an old friend. "I told you I'd come back," she said, her words soft, but they carried the weight of a promise, of a curse. The rancher felt the words sink into him, heavier than the air around them. He couldn't explain it, couldn't put a name to it, but something had shifted in that moment, something between him and the land, between him and Clara. He wanted to move, to run, but his feet felt stuck to the ground, as if the earth was holding him there. He watched as she leaned closer to the well, her face now inches from the edge. She was listening, listening for something he couldn't hear, something beyond him, beyond the ranch, beyond everything he knew. Then she reached into the well. Her arm moved with the same eerie calmness, as though she was sure of what she'd find. She felt around inside the darkness, her fingers brushing the cool stones. The sound of the earth shifting beneath her touch made him shiver, and then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. Clara's hand withdrew, empty. She sat back on her heels, her face a mask of calm that didn't reach her eyes. "Nothing," she said simply, as if she had expected this, as if the well had given all it would. She looked up at him then, her eyes meeting him for the first time since she'd begun. "Nothing?" he asked, his voice tight. "You heard it." "I heard it." "What do you mean, nothing?" Clara smiled faintly, her lips curving upward, but there was no humor in it. "It's waiting, just like you." Her words hit him harder than any blow. He couldn't tell if it was the well, the earth, or the girl standing in front of him, but something had changed. He could feel it in his chest, in the pit of his stomach. Waiting for what? His voice cracked, barely a whisper now. Clara didn't answer. She just stood up, brushing off the dust from her skirt. Her gaze didn't leave the well. She looked at it like it was a part of her, like it had always been there, always calling to her. And then she turned and walked back toward the house, leaving him standing in the silence with the echo of the knocks still ringing in his ears. The well stood behind them, dry and empty, but in the back of his mind, he could still hear it. 3 knocks, calling him back, calling them all back. Clara didn't say a word as she handed him the second photo. Her fingers were steady, but the look in her eyes, it was all too calm, too knowing. She didn't wait for him to take it. She simply extended her hand, the image pressed flat between her palms. He stared at the photo in her hand, already feeling the weight of it before he even touched it. There was something familiar about the way she held it, the way it called to him. Slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing hers for a second longer than he intended. The chill of her skin struck him like a spark, a reminder that there was something he couldn't touch, something buried too deep to find. The photo wasn't the same as the last one. This one was clearer, cleaner, more real. A mother and child. A woman he didn't recognize, standing with a little girl in her arms, their faces lit by the same soft light. The woman's smile was warm, like she was waiting for something, someone. His breath caught. The little girl in her arms. It was Clara. It was Clara as a child, her face soft and innocent, eyes wide with wonder. But it wasn't just the child in the photo that made his chest tighten. It was the woman beside her, the woman holding her. The woman was familiar. He couldn't place her, not at first, but it was there. The way her hair framed her face, the shape of her jaw. It was a face he thought he would never see again. His hand trembled as he stared at the photo, and for a moment he thought his world might collapse. He couldn't make sense of it. He couldn't make sense of any of it. "Where did you get this?" His voice came out rough, strained. Clara didn't answer at first. She just watched him, her eyes steady, patient. He looked at the woman in the picture again, studying the edges of her face, the way her hands cradled the child. "This ain't me," he said finally, his voice low. "I don't know who this is, but it's not me." He felt a sharp pain in his chest, a pressure that threatened to swallow him whole. His fingers tightened around the photo, the edges crumpling beneath his grasp, and without thinking, he tore it in half. The sound of the paper ripping echoed in the quiet room, sharp and final. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't react at all. The two pieces of the photo hung in his hands, the edges jagged and torn. His heart was still racing, and for a moment, he couldn't understand why he'd done it. The pieces of the photo were now just paper, a destroyed memory, something that had meant something to him once but no longer did. "You don't remember her," Clara said quietly, her voice even, like she had expected this, like she'd known it would happen. "Not yet." His breath caught, the words sinking deep into him. He looked at her then, his heart heavy with confusion. "Not yet?" His hand trembled, still holding the torn pieces of the photo. He wanted to yell, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. "No," Clara replied softly, "but you will." He stared at the pieces in his hands, unable to look away. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Clara didn't move, didn't blink. She only nodded toward the photo, toward the torn edges in his hands. "That was your wife, and that's your daughter." The words cut through him like a blade sinking into soft flesh. His wife? His daughter? He couldn't remember. He looked at the torn pieces in his hands, the faces of strangers staring back at him. They weren't strangers. He could feel it. Somewhere deep down, he could feel it, but he couldn't grasp it. He couldn't hold on to it. It slipped away every time he tried to reach for it. Clara took a slow step toward him, and without asking, she reached for the photo, the torn halves of the image. He let her take it from him, his fingers numb like he didn't have control of them anymore. She looked at the pieces of the photo, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up at him, and her eyes seemed to search his face, like she was looking for something he wasn't ready to give. "It's okay," she said softly, like she was trying to comfort him, but there was no warmth in her voice. "You don't have to remember. Not yet." He felt a knot in his stomach, a mixture of anger and fear. "I don't know what's happening. I don't know who you are. I don't know anything anymore." Clara stood still, her eyes locked on his, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he saw something like pity in her gaze. But it wasn't a pity for him. It was a pity that he didn't understand. "I'm not the one you need to remember," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "She's the one you're running from." The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. He looked at the torn photo, the edges jagged and raw. The faces of strangers stared back at him, but there was something haunting about them, something familiar, something he could almost remember, but not yet. And, for a moment, he wasn't sure if he ever would. The house had always been full of quiet, the kind of quiet that lived in the corners, the creaks in the floorboards, and the way the walls seemed to close in when night fell. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was heavy, like it had been holding its breath for too long. For years he had walked through its rooms, with his head down, avoiding the places he didn't want to see, ignoring the parts of it that held memories too sharp to touch. He didn't realize that Claire was following him until she spoke. "Where does that door lead?" He froze, his hand still resting on the worn banister at the top of the stairs. His gaze shifted toward the hallway where the door stood, small, inconspicuous, like every other door in the house. But it wasn't the same. It was the one door he never opened, the one he had locked away. He hadn't even thought about it in years, and yet here it was, staring him down like an old ghost. "That's just a storage room," he muttered, his voice thick with something he didn't want to admit. She didn't move. Didn't blink. She just stared at it, her eyes fixed on the handle, like she could see through it. "That's where she hit us." He could feel his throat tighten, a lump growing there. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't look at the door. He'd gone years without needing to, but now it felt like it was all coming back. All the things he'd buried, all the things he'd forced himself to forget. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too sharp. But Clara didn't flinch. "You do," she said, her voice soft, like she was telling him something he already knew. "You're just not ready to remember it." He turned away, his back to her. The house felt too small now, the walls closing in like they always did when he was trapped in his thoughts. He had built this place. He had filled it with silence and memories that didn't belong to him anymore. Or at least he had convinced himself they didn't. But Clara was different. She knew things he had never told her. And there she was, standing in the hallway, staring at the door like it was a promise. His hand shook as he reached for the door handle, the metal cold against his palm. He hadn't opened it in so long. Too long. But now, it was all he could think about. The door that had stayed locked, the room he had shut away, the secret that had never been spoken aloud. He turned the handle slowly, the lock clicking open with a sound that seemed too loud in the silence of the house. When the door creaked open, the air inside was stale, the scent of old dust and forgotten things hanging heavy in the room. The light from the hallway spilled into the dark space, revealing nothing more than the shadows of old furniture and boxes stacked against the walls. But Clara stepped forward, unafraid, as though she had already seen everything inside. "Come in," she said, her voice low but certain. "You can't hide from it forever." He hesitated, his eyes darting between the darkness of the room and Clara's unwavering gaze. She didn't need to ask again. She didn't have to. There was nothing left to hide from. He stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight, and the door shut behind them with a soft thud. The room smelled of forgotten memories, of things left behind and never touched again. It was colder in here, colder than the rest of the house. The shadows felt deeper, like they were pulling at him, reminding him of the things he had buried. Clara walked to the far side of the room, her fingers brushing against the boxes, the furniture covered with old sheets. She didn't look back at him. She just moved, like she had been here 100 times before. She stopped at the back wall and pointed. There, hidden in the corner, was an old chest. He hadn't touched it in years, but he knew it well. He'd put it there himself, locked it away, like it didn't matter, like it didn't belong. "That's where she hid us," Clara said again, her voice quieter now, like it was a confession. "That's where you kept her." He felt his chest tighten, the weight of her words sinking into him. He wanted to move, to close the door and pretend he hadn't heard her, but his feet felt stuck to the ground. He couldn't breathe. The chest sat there, waiting for him, waiting for the moment when he would finally open it. He stepped toward it slowly, his heart pounding in his ears. The wood was weathered, scarred with time, but the lock was still there, solid, unyielding. His fingers brushed the metal, and for a second he thought about turning away. But he didn't. He couldn't. He reached down and unlatched it. The lock fell open with a soft click, and the lid creaked as it rose. Inside there were clothes, old journals, and a blanket that hadn't been touched in years. But there was something else, something that made his stomach drop. At the bottom of the chest, hidden beneath the fabric, was a photo. A photograph of a woman, her face barely visible, the edges worn and torn. He recognized her, even though he had never seen her before. The room seemed to grow colder as he stared at the photo, his hands shaking as he picked it up. He had forgotten her face. He had forgotten everything about her. But now it was all coming back. The woman who had been locked away in this room. The woman who had left him with nothing but silence and memories. Clara stood behind him, her presence steady, unshaken. "You know who she is," she said softly. He closed his eyes, the weight of the past pressing down on him. "I do," he whispered. "I always have." But now he had to face it. He had to face everything he had hidden. The floorboards in the corner of the room were loose. They had always been loose, even when the house was new. A slow, steady creak in the wood whenever someone walked too close. He never thought much of it. Not until now. Clara was gone for the moment, out by the creek, her back to the house. He could hear the wind picking up, but everything inside was quiet. Too quiet. The house held its breath again, just like it always had, but today felt different. There was something waiting, something he wasn't ready to face. He crouched down beside the old wooden chest, his hands already dirty from opening it. His fingers brushed along the edge of the floorboards, the grain worn smooth from years of use. He felt around, pushing at the wood, until one of the planks shifted just enough for him to wedge a knife beneath it. The board came loose with a soft crack, revealing a space beneath, dark and untouched by the years. The dust that rose from the hole was thick, but something caught his eye. Something more than just dirt. A leather-bound book, its edges curled, its spine cracked, the ranch's birth log. He pulled it free, his fingers trembling as he dusted it off. The cover was old, faded with time, but the leather was still intact. He flipped the pages carefully, the sound of the paper turning soft and slow, like it had been waiting for this moment. The names inside were familiar, all of them. Families that had worked the land, names he knew from the old stories, the ones told around fires and at supper tables. They had built this place, and they had bled for it. He turned the pages until he found what he was looking for. Her name. It was written there, plain as day, alongside the other names, but it was followed by something that shouldn't have been there. A symbol, a scorch mark. The ink was smeared, like the page had been burned, and then hastily wiped, but there was no mistaking it. The mark was deliberate, carved into the paper with a sharp hand. The symbol was old, a mark he recognized from somewhere buried deep in his memory, a symbol of something lost, something forgotten. His fingers trembled as he traced the edges of the burn, the outline of the mark seared into his mind. It was familiar. It was something he had seen before. But where? He flipped back through the pages, his heart pounding now, faster with each turn. He couldn't stop himself. He had to find it. He had to find the answer. The pages blurred together, names and dates and symbols, all fading into one another like a dream he couldn't remember. He stopped when he found another name, a name he hadn't expected to see. His wife's name. She was there, right next to the symbol, beneath it, the scorch mark. His breath hitched. The room seemed to tilt around him, the walls closing in like they were suffocating him. He looked at the name again, but it didn't make sense. The date beside it was wrong. Too early. Too late. He felt a coldness spread through his chest, a weight he hadn't felt in years. The fire that had taken everything. The ranch had burned. It had all burned, and she had been in it. The fire that had taken his wife. But why? Why had she been listed here, alongside a child he didn't remember? Relinquished by fire. The words echoed in his mind like a death sentence. He closed the book, but it was too late. The truth had already crawled into his bones, digging into places he had closed off long ago. The page wouldn't let him forget. The ledger had told him everything, or at least, enough. The door creaked behind him. He didn't turn. Clara was there, standing in the doorway. He hadn't heard her approach, hadn't even felt her presence until she spoke. "You found it," she said, her voice quiet, like she had known he would. His chest tightened, and he didn't know if it was from fear or anger. It didn't matter anymore. "What does it mean?" he asked, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Clara stepped forward, her eyes steady, like she had been waiting for him to ask. She didn't look at the ledger. She didn't need to. "It means she was taken," Clara said softly. But she wasn't the only one. The air between them thickened, heavy with things unsaid. He didn't ask her to explain. He didn't need to. She was right. He already knew. But the question that remained, the one that burned deeper than the scorch mark in the ledger, was this. What had been taken, and why? The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the ranch. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, the kind that clung to your skin and never let go. He stood at the window, his hands gripping the sill, staring out at the garden beyond. The night had a strange stillness to it, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Clara had gone inside, her silhouette disappearing into the darkness of the house. He didn't know why he couldn't sleep. Maybe it was the memory of the ledger, the burn mark still fresh in his mind. Or maybe it was the way Clara had looked at him earlier, like she knew something he didn't. The door creaked open behind him. He didn't turn. He knew who it was. The sheriff. The heavy footsteps echoed in the stillness of the room, and the rancher felt a shiver run down his spine. Sheriff Finch had returned just like he said he would, but something was different. The sheriff wasn't alone. There was something in his eyes, something hidden beneath the calm mask he always wore. "I thought you'd be in bed by now," the sheriff said, his voice low, tight. The rancher didn't answer, just kept his eyes on the garden. He could feel the sheriff's gaze on him, the weight of it pressing down on his shoulders. "You're not worried about her?" the sheriff asked, his tone harder now, tinged with something else. Clara, the girl who had shown up out of nowhere, who had changed everything. I'm not worried about her, the rancher replied, his voice steady, but it wasn't the truth. He had been worried since the moment Clara walked into his life, but he couldn't admit it. Not to the sheriff. Not to anyone. You should be, the sheriff said, stepping closer to the window, his boots scraping on the floor. She's dangerous. The rancher turned, finally meeting the sheriff's eyes. There was something in them. Flicker of fear, something that didn't belong. The sheriff's hand moved to his side, where his badge should have been, but it wasn't there. Where's your badge? The rancher asked, his voice low. The sheriff's face stiffened, but he didn't answer. He just stepped back, his eyes narrowing. I'll be back in the morning, he said, his voice tight. There's work to be done. And with that, he turned and left, disappearing into the night. The rancher stood at the window, watching until the sheriff's figure was swallowed by the darkness. By morning, the sheriff was dead. The garden was still, the early morning light casting long shadows over the rows of plants, the flowers hanging heavy with dew. The air was cool, crisp with the smell of fresh earth and the promise of a new day. But something was wrong. The rancher walked to the garden, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He had heard the stories, the whispers about the sheriff, but he hadn't expected this. Not like this. The body was face down in the irrigation trench, the water still and dark, reflecting the sky above. The sheriff's face was pale, his eyes wide open, unseeing. His uniform was damp, the fabric clinging to his skin like a shroud. The rancher's breath caught in his throat as he knelt beside the body, his hands trembling. He didn't have to look far to see it. Clara's footprints were imprinted in the soft earth beside the trench, leading straight to the spot where the sheriff had fallen. The prints were fresh, the dirt still damp from her steps. She had been here, and she had led him here. He stood up slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. Clara, she had been here, in the garden, in the night, and now the sheriff was dead. He reached into the sheriff's pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the badge. It wasn't the sheriff's, it was hers. Clara's. The rancher stood there for a moment, the weight of the badge in his hand. He could feel the coldness of it, the weight of it, pressing into his palm like a reminder of something darker than he was ready to face. The badge was still warm. It didn't make sense. None of it did. He turned, his heart racing, and looked back at the house. He could see Clara standing on the porch, watching him, her face expressionless, her eyes unreadable. She had known. She had always known. The rancher didn't know what to do, what to say. He didn't know how to stop it, how to fix it. The only thing he knew was that it was too late to turn back. The kitchen was dim, the early morning light filtering through the window, casting long shadows across the worn table. He sat there, his elbows on the surface, his fingers running through the same old papers he'd been ignoring for weeks. The silence in the room felt heavy, the weight of everything he hadn't said hanging between them. Clara sat across from him, her sketchpad open in front of her. She had been quiet all morning, but he could feel her eyes on him. He didn't look up. He couldn't. Something in the air told him that whatever was coming, he wasn't ready for it. She hadn't said much since last night. The sheriff was gone, dead. And Clara. She was still here, still sitting across from him like she was the one who belonged. The one who had always belonged. He heard the soft scratch of pencil on paper. It was slow, deliberate, as if she had all the time in the world. He tried to ignore it, tried to keep his eyes on the papers in front of him, but the sound was relentless, pulling at something inside him. Finally, he couldn't stand it any longer. He looked up. Clara was sketching his face. The lines of his features were already taking shape, the sharp angles of his jaw, the tired eyes that hadn't slept in days. His mouth was set in a tight line, his expression closed off like it had been for years. But she had captured it perfectly. Too perfect. He hadn't realized how much of his face was a mask until she drew it, how much he'd hidden. The lines, the tension in his face, the way his eyes always seemed to carry the weight of a past he could never shake. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice thick with a mix of confusion and something else, something that felt like dread. Clara didn't look up. She kept sketching, her pencil moving with practiced ease. She was focused, intent, like she was pulling the truth from him without asking. It made his chest tighten, a discomfort he couldn't shake. "I'm drawing you," she said softly, her voice almost casual, but there was something in it, something that made him shiver. "You don't look like you think you do." He didn't know what to say to that. He didn't want to acknowledge the way she'd peeled back the layers of him without even trying. He didn't want to think about how much of himself he had hidden, how much he still hid. "You know, I've been drawing people my whole life," she continued, not looking up from the page. "It's always the same. I know their faces before I even see them. I can see everything that's buried there." He felt the air around him tighten, the words hanging between them like a challenge. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, trying to avoid the pull of her eyes. "And what's buried there?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but failing. She paused for a moment, her pencil hovering over the page. Then she spoke softly, her words almost a whisper. "Everything. The things you've tried to forget. The things you can't hide." The tension in the room thickened, and he couldn't tell if it was her words or the way she was drawing him that made his skin crawl. He wanted to get up, to leave the table, but he couldn't. He was frozen, watching her hand move, sketching his face with a kind of reverence he didn't understand. When she was finished, she sat back in her chair, her eyes still locked on him. The portrait was perfect, too perfect. His face, his tired eyes, his mouth clenched shut. But beside him there was another figure, a shadow, faint but unmistakable. He leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who is that?" he asked, his voice tight, his throat dry. Clara's gaze didn't waver from the page. "You don't know them," she said, her tone quiet, almost distant. "But you will." The figure beside him was a woman, her face faint, almost ghostly, but it was there. She had the same eyes, the same shape to her face, the same expression. He couldn't place her. He didn't want to place her. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. Clara put the pencil down and met his gaze finally. "It's time," she said simply. "Time to stop running." The words hit him like a punch. He wanted to ask her what she meant, wanted to demand answers, but he couldn't speak. The air around him felt thick, suffocating. Clara stood up, the chair scraping against the floor as she moved toward the door. She paused for a moment, her back to him, and then she turned her head slightly. "She's waiting for you," she said, almost like a promise. He watched her walk out, leaving him alone with the drawing, with his face, with the figure beside him, and with the weight of something he wasn't ready to face. The pencil sketches of his past, of the things he had buried and forgotten, sat on the table in front of him, and for the first time, he realized he couldn't run from them any longer. The attic was stifling, thick with the dust of forgotten years. Boxes stacked high against the walls, all things packed away like they were never meant to be seen again. He hadn't been up here in a long time, not since she died, not since everything changed. The air was musty, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight as he moved through the clutter. His eyes scanned the space, searching for something, anything. There was a box in the corner, its edges frayed, and the lid barely held together. He knelt down, pulling it free from the pile, the smell of old paper and faded leather filling his lungs. The Bible was heavy in his hands, the pages yellowed with age, the cover soft from years of wear. He knew it well. It belonged to his wife, the one he never talked about, the one who had vanished too soon, her name buried beneath years of silence. He opened it carefully, flipping through the pages. It had always been a strange thing. This Bible, her Bible. She'd marked it up, written in the margins, underlined passages that never made sense to him. It was her way of keeping things close, of hiding what couldn't be spoken. He thumbed through the Old Testament, his mind drifting, until he reached the book of Revelation. The pages were thinner here, the edges ragged. She'd always been drawn to the final book of the Bible, to its cryptic words and visions of fire. And then he saw it. In the margin, just beneath the verses about the beast and the end of the world, there was a name written in a careful, precise hand. His breath caught. He leaned closer, his fingers tracing the words. There, in dried rose-colored ink, was her name. The name he had never known. Her real name. The letters were faint, the ink fading like the memory of her. It looked almost like blood, too dark, too red to be just ink. But it was her name, the one she had never told him, the one she had hidden so carefully. He ran his hand over the page, the sharp edges of the paper pressing against his fingertips. Her name. He whispered it aloud, tasting it on his tongue like a foreign language. Clara. The word felt wrong, foreign, like it had never belonged to her, like it had never belonged to him. He didn't want it to be true, but it was. Clara, the name he had known her by for so long, the name she had carried with her, the name she had claimed for herself. But this was something else. He turned the Bible carefully, his fingers trembling as he reached for the next page. The ink was smudged here, faded like it had been touched too many times. He stared at the words. It was clear now. The name wasn't hers to begin with. It was the name of someone else, someone who had been lost, buried, erased. He felt the weight of it in his chest, the heaviness of the truth pressing down on him. Clara. That was the name she had chosen for herself, the name she had worn for all these years. But there was something else, something she had kept hidden. The Bible seemed to pulse with a strange energy now, like it had been waiting for him to find it, waiting for him to read it. The name was written in blood, or something close to it. He could smell the faint scent of roses in the air, even though there were no flowers nearby. His mind reeled, spinning. Why? Why had she hidden it from him? Why had she kept this secret, buried it in the pages of a Bible, never once letting him see it? He closed the book with a snap, the sound echoing in the attic, the silence following like a shadow. His hands were shaking now, and his heart was racing. He had to understand it, had to know why this name mattered, but the more he thought about it, the more the questions piled up. Clara. This name written in blood could mean everything, or it could mean nothing. He didn't know. The Bible was a link to something darker, something deeper than he had ever realized, something that had been buried in the ground for so long, something that Clara had known all along. He stood up slowly, the Bible heavy in his hands. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do with it, but he couldn't let it go. Not yet. Not when everything he thought he knew was unraveling. He stared at the attic door, the dim light creeping in from the hallway. He had to find her. He had to find the answers. But Clara, or whoever she truly was, had already disappeared again, leaving him with only this Bible, and the name she had hidden for so long. He felt the cold air in the attic, like the house itself was breathing, waiting for him to follow. But he wasn't ready. Not yet. Not until he understood why Clara's real name had been buried in the pages of that book. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the field, as Clara stood by the old oak tree, her silhouette sharp against the horizon. She didn't look at him as he stepped out of the house, the door creaking behind him. She just stood there waiting. He could feel the weight of her presence, heavy and unyielding, like something ancient that had always been there, something he couldn't escape. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of earth and dust, the kind of smell that clung to everything here. She had the shovel in her hand. He didn't ask where she had gotten it or why she was standing there, a figure in the fading light. He just knew. He knew the way she moved, the way she always knew things before he did, before anyone did. "It's time," she said, her voice soft, but it echoed in the stillness of the field, like it belonged to the land itself. He swallowed, his throat tight. He stepped closer, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth beneath him. The air felt thick now, heavier than it had been all day. There was something in the wind, something that tugged at him, like it was pulling him toward the inevitable. "What are we doing?" he asked, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. Clara didn't look at him. She just pointed to the ground at her feet, where the soil was already disturbed. A small hole had been dug, the earth turned over and left open, waiting. The shovel sat beside it, its metal head catching the last light of the day. "Bury it," she said, her voice steady. He looked down at the small locket in his hand, the one that had been passed from Clara to him, the one that had been with them all along. It was warm now, the metal smooth against his palm, but there was something cold about it, something that didn't belong. He had known this moment was coming, but standing here, with the field stretching out before him, the quiet settling around them like a weight, he wasn't ready. He didn't want to bury it. Not yet. He knelt beside her, the soil crumbling under his knees, and placed the locket carefully into the hole. His fingers brushed the metal one last time, and he couldn't help but feel the weight of it, of everything that had come before. As he covered the locket with earth, the wind kicked up, swirling around them. The dust rose into the air, a cloud that caught the fading light, but it didn't fall. It hovered, suspended in the air, like it didn't belong to the world of the living. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't say anything as the wind tugged at her hair and her dress, the fabric twisting around her like it was part of the storm. She just watched him, her eyes steady, waiting for him to finish. The earth settled around the locket, the hole filled with soil. The wind slowly died down, leaving only the silence. The air felt colder now, and the weight of the moment settled in his chest like a stone. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands. Clara was already walking away, heading toward the house without a word, her footsteps light and sure. He watched her, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that they had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. He followed her slowly, his boots crunching on the dry ground, but when he reached the porch, she was already gone inside. The door creaked shut behind her, and he was left standing alone, the wind still tugging at his clothes, the feeling of ash still heavy in the air. He didn't go inside right away. Instead, he turned back to the field, to the spot where they had buried the locket. It was just a small mound of earth now, indistinguishable from the rest of the field, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. The wind kicked up again, swirling around him like it had a purpose, like it was trying to tell him something. But he didn't listen. The sun had finally set, leaving the world in shadows. The house behind him was dark, and the only light now came from the stars above, distant and cold. He walked into the house slowly, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. Inside, Clara sat at the table, her face lit by the dim glow of the lantern. She didn't look up when he entered, didn't acknowledge him at all. She just sat there, waiting. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the weight of the night pressing down on him. He couldn't speak, couldn't find the words. Clara was already looking at him, her eyes unreadable. "It's done," she said softly. "You've buried what needed to be buried." He didn't answer. He didn't know what else to say. But as he sat down across from her, he knew that the world had changed. The past had been buried with the locket, and whatever came next, they would face it together. The house felt different now. The silence wasn't just the quiet of the land anymore. It was the kind of silence that came when something was over, when the last thread had been pulled, and everything was left hanging. The air in the house had thickened, and the walls seemed to close in around him, as if they were holding their breath, waiting for him to understand. Clara had stopped speaking. She didn't need to. She moved through the house like a shadow now, like she belonged to it, like she had always belonged. He watched her day after day as she went about her business, her chores, her quiet movements through the rooms. But there was something different about her, something that hadn't been there before. She was more than just a girl now. She was a part of this place, a part of everything that had happened. The ranch was no longer the place. It had been before. The air had changed. The soil felt heavier beneath his boots. Even the wind felt different now. It carried whispers, soft as if it had something to say. But it never did. He stood by the window, watching the land stretch out before him, the fields quiet and still, just as they had always been. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the land. The wind shifted, kicking up dust from the field where they had buried the locket. But this time, the dust didn't settle. It hung there, suspended, like it was waiting for something. Clara walked past him, her feet silent on the floor, and for the first time, he noticed the faint lines of wear on her shoes. The same shoes she'd worn since she arrived. The shoes she'd never taken off, even when she had been barefoot in the field, even when she had walked beside the well. "Clara," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "It's over, isn't it? This curse. What we buried. The locket." She didn't answer at first. She stopped in the doorway, turning back to face him, her eyes calm, unreadable. "It was never a curse," she said softly. "It was a promise, a contract that needed to be fulfilled." He stared at her, unable to speak. Her words settled over him like a weight, pressing down harder than anything he had ever felt. He wanted to ask more, to demand an explanation, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't understand. He wasn't sure he ever would. Clara stepped closer to him, her movements slow, deliberate. She placed her hand on his shoulder, the touch light but firm. Her skin was cold, like it had been touched by something older than time. "You've remembered now," she said, her voice low. "You've remembered what she wanted you to forget." His chest tightened, and for a moment he could hear the distant echo of the well, The knocks that had answered him all those nights ago. The fire, the ashes, the name written in blood. The land had been waiting for him to remember. The land doesn't forget, Clara said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. It never forgets. The room felt colder now. The silence between them stretched longer until it became unbearable. He felt the weight of everything he had hidden, everything he had denied, all of it pressing down on him. But Clara was still there, still watching him, her face unreadable. "You're a part of it now," she said softly, almost tenderly, "and I'm a part of you. This place has taken us in, just as it took her." The locket was only the beginning. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw her for what she truly was. A part of the land, a part of the history that had been buried here. She wasn't just a girl, she was the echo of everything that had come before. She was the memory of the woman he had loved, of the past he had tried to bury. Clara's eyes softened, but there was no pity in them. Only understanding. "The land will remember you," she whispered, "and it will remember me. But we're done now. We've buried it all." He didn't know what to say to that. He didn't need to. There was nothing left to be said. She stepped away from him, and as she did, he felt something shift. It wasn't the earth beneath his feet. It wasn't the house. It was something inside him, a piece of himself that had been lost, that had been buried, now finally coming to the surface. Clara stopped in the doorway, turning back to him one last time. "I'll go now," she said, "but I'm not really gone." He didn't move. He couldn't. He just stood there, watching her walk out into the fading light, her figure disappearing into the distance. The door closed softly behind her, and for a moment, everything went still. But the land didn't forget. It never would. And neither would he.